Mr. Speaker, in Western liberal democracies, we recognise that individual choice, particularly individual choice that has dire implications for other individuals, is always qualified where there are individual harms that are direct and compelling, and where the government has a role in creating social cohesion and ceding those rights for the purposes of the common good of society. I bring you 3 points. First, who homeschools and why. Second, why the government has a compelling case for intervention in this regard. And thirdly, why parental choice is qualified. On the first point of who homeschools, we say that fundamentally there are 3 groups who homeschool. Firstly, we say that there are religious groups who are concerned to ensure that their children are not exposed to values in a public education system, and who are concerned to insulate their children from any kind of influence outside their religious constructs. Secondly, we say there are people who have an intellectual interest in educating their children. These are the kind of people like maths professors who are concerned to ensure that their children grow up to be just like them and learn a particular type of information at the expense of others. And thirdly, we say that there are people who have radical attitudes towards the state and don't want their children participating in that regard. We're talking about people who are libertarians who've wandered off the reservation, the kind of people who deny their children access to vaccines. So why do they homeschool? Ladies and gentlemen, we said these groups homeschool primarily to inculcate their children with values to the exclusion of other values. This applies both religiously and intellectually, because we say that parents have a vested interest when they homeschool in preventing children from accessing the kind of mainstream curriculum that the state teaches, but more importantly, accessing the mainstream values of other children within that system. We say that fundamentally, this is the interest that people are protecting when they homeschool their children. So why does the government have a role in intervening in this particular situation? We say at the core of our analysis is the proposition that any individual within a society cedes rights to the government for the purposes of social cohesion. That underlies any governmental analysis in relation to things like crime, education, welfare. Individuals within a society cede rights on the basis that the government has a capacity to influence their decisions and promote their achievement of the good life. So we say there are 3 reasons, 3 imperatives why the government intervenes in this situation. Firstly, social capacity. We say that at the end of the day, the government has a role in setting the kinds of skills and values and attitudes of individuals within a society. We say that the government has the capacity and indeed an interest in ensuring that individuals within a society can contribute to the overall benefit of that society by way of economic, generation of economic interests like the production of income, contributing in terms of employment and things like that. But more importantly, we say that the government has a role in also building individual capacity to engage with other people in that society for the purpose of generating wealth and generating social cohesion. Secondly, we say that the government has a role in ensuring equality of opportunity. The purpose of the government fundamentally is fulfilling access to the good life for all individuals within a society. And we say that what the government does in intervening in this regard is provides the best possible range of opportunities to every individual in that society. That's the reason why people buy into the social contract, because they recognise that the government can provide them with access to opportunities. So we say that the government's better placed than parents in this regard in relation to the point about equality of opportunity, because A, they have access to more information, they have the capacity to understand what sort of skills individuals need to be properly functioning members of the society. B, because they guard against poor individual choice, they eliminate illogical factors that parents take into account in making decisions about education. And thirdly, they have a degree of objectivity. So teachers are well trained to assess individual performance, see how students are comparing to other students within the classroom, and engage in relative assessment on that regard. So they have the capacity to constantly assess the individual's performance within that society. So we say that there's a substantial imperative in terms of individual capacity, in terms of opportunity. But thirdly, we say that the government has a role because it has to ensure a degree of democratic participation. The whole idea of the state is premised on the understanding that individuals can make decisions and choices at the ballot box, both in relation to their individual interests, but also in relation to the interests of other people within a society. So we say that that's premised on 2 things. Firstly, the idea that you need to know things, you need to know a broad range of facts about life, about social institutions, about things that affect other people. And thirdly, you need the capacity to reason, to take those facts into account and arriving at decisions in relation to individuals. We say that there's a harm when individuals can't exercise their vote and participate in democracies effectively, because they don't have that capacity to reason and they don't have that fundamental knowledge. And this is particularly important in the context of making decisions that affect others. Like if you're homeschooled, you may have a set of values that you can protect on your own in the ballot box, but we say that you lack the capacity to effectively engage with the preferences and needs of other individuals when you participate in democracy. So that's the end of my analysis on why the government has a compelling role in terms of intervention in this particular instance. Secondly, to the notion of parental choice. Now, we accept fundamentally from the outset that parents do have a serious role and an important role in a child's education. We accept that they have choices to make and that they have rights in relation to their children. But we say that is never unqualified, and it's never unqualified, and it's particularly qualified in instances where there are compelling harms in relation to the individuals. So we recognise that children have rights that are apart from their parents. They're not chattels that belong to their parents. They are individuals that have unique rights that are inherent within them. And we say that the state can always intervene to vindicate those rights and protect those interests. So why does the state intervene? We say the state intervenes in situations of clear and compelling harm. That's why we intervene when children are being abused. We intervene in poor health decisions in relation to children. We take children away from their parents when their fundamental needs are not being met. And we say education is an important fundamental need in this regard. We say that there are two particular individual harms that attract to every individual that is homeschooled. First, an intellectual harm, and secondly, an interpersonal harm. So turning to the intellectual harm, we say that the big problem with homeschooling is that it fundamentally removes material from the curriculum. Like we say that sure, the state can mandate a basic level of knowledge within a curriculum, but it can never control and make sure that curriculum is delivered in the way that it can in relation to high schools. So we say, like public high schools. So we say that individuals within a curriculum necessarily have less state control and less access to quality material in relation to that curriculum. But secondly, we say that there's distorted emphasis. Like we say that particularly in relation to the category of people who educate their children for intellectual reasons, there's often a distorted emphasis. So maths is taught to the exclusion of English, humanities and other sciences. We say that these kind of parents have the capacity to distort the kind of relative values of their child in relation to that education. And so we say that there are compelling harms on that basis that can't be remedied by things like standardised tests, because fundamentally those tests don't address the underlying distorted information and the omission of material from the curriculum. And more importantly, those tests occur at the end of an education. So if a child has failed to learn things, failed to grasp basic principles, it's not something that can be remedied down the track when the test is completed and the child hasn't passed. So we say that at the end of the day, there is a tangible intellectual harm to individuals. Secondly, interpersonal harms. Parents don't have the capacity to socialise their children. An important part of school is a kind of schoolyard education that occurs when individuals interact with other people in the playground and interact with other people in their class. Parents can't cure that in a homeschooling context, which is why people who emerge from homeschool are statistically far more likely to have poor interpersonal skills. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a role of government, there is personal choice is not qualified, and for that reason we're very proud to propose.
Thank you for all these comments. And now I'd call the speaker, Peter.
Mr. Speaker, we heard actually very little from the first affirmative speaker about what homeschooling is and why people choose to do it. And what we believe firmly on the negative team is that homeschooling provides better educational outcomes for the vast majority of students who use it. But more than that, it provides essential religious and cultural identity for parents and communities who have a right to that identity and who homeschooling is critical for that. There are 2 points of rebuttal I want to look at before moving on to our case. The first of these is about their conception of where rights balance in society, and the second of these is about the specific harms to individual opportunity that they saw under homeschooling. So the first of these, on the rights balance and how it stood. They told us that, to quote Matt Sherman, we should concede practically everything in society for the sake of social cohesion. That's not true. If we did that, we'd be Singapore, right? And in the vast majority of Western liberal democracies, we actually preference individual autonomy as high or higher than social cohesion. That we accept a certain degree of uncertainty in society because we recognise that the most important thing is that individuals are free to pursue what is happy to them. And we limit it in the rare cases, not as the norm. So conceptually, we disagree with their understanding of how our society works. But then they said it wasn't even particularly about social cohesion in a serious way. It was about ensuring that individuals could contribute to society. We just reject straight out that homeschooling denies the ability of people to contribute to society. And as I'll be telling you more, we think actually there are often better educational outcomes, but at least probably about the minimum standards that we enforce equally under both a homeschooling and a school environment. Then in terms of the opportunities to children, in the first part of Matt's speech we got fairly generalist analysis about the government knows more and kids need skills and that parents are not objective. We say, well, that's correct. Parents are subjective because they know their children better than the government that is objective. Objective because they don't know the needs of individual children. They don't know the different learning abilities and needs of different children. They asserted that children need more skills, skills they couldn't get from homeschooling. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we think the skills you need to engage in society are minimum standards of literacy, numeracy, and understanding of how the societal system works. And all of those are covered for in minimum standards that are required in homeschooling also. They couldn't tell us what these extra skills were above and beyond that. They also had two practical harms that they told us in terms of parental rights. They told us the intellectual harm to children who are educated with different emphases. And we actually think that in many cases that distorted emphasis is good, because in the vast majority of homeschooling cases where that happens, the kids want it. Not all kids want equal education in maths and sciences. You already know in the vast majority of cases, kids as young as 5, 6 and 7 already have a very strong idea about the sort of careers and futures they want to pursue. We think homeschooling, and whether they like maths, whether they like English, whether they like science, homeschooling best allows the prodigies, the kids with different emphasis, to actually realise their full potential earlier on. When it comes to socialisation, we say, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you much more in my analysis, that the glib assertion that you get better socialisation in schools doesn't hold. That particularly for many of the cases where children are homeschooled, they are cases where they would not have positive socialisation experiences at school. And finally, in terms of individual opportunities, we just want to point out that they had a narrow conception of what those were at all. Because more importantly, we say there is a right to children to have a religious and cultural identity and a history. And that rebuts this conception of individual rights too. So, what do I bring to us in this debate? Firstly, I just want to be clear on what we think our model for homeschooling is. We think it's largely based on what it is, that there are minimum standards of curricula that homeschool education has to deliver, that are the same curricula that school education has to deliver. And those are the small set of core subjects. We think we would have those tested every year by an external teacher who can assess the quality of work that's being done. More than that, we're even happy to concede that we might get a social worker to visit the houses of homeschooled people once a year, just to check that everything is going well in those communities. But we think we set the same minimum standards there. And just as schools even themselves have the ability to choose how to teach those core requirements, something they supported, social schools. So, 3 points. Why is this essential for respecting the rights of parental autonomy, and particularly the religious identity of parents? Secondly, why is it better for kids educationally? And thirdly, why is it better for kids socially? Well, let's start with parental autonomy. Why do we give parents power in society? We think that's because, unlike what the affirmative team thinks, we think there's actually practically zero consensus on the best way to raise a child. Every child is different. Every child coming from different communities with different backgrounds has different cultural norms established at a very young age. And all of those place different expectations and different emphases, meaning there will be different responses to inputs from outside. And that's why we think parents are in the best place to shape the life of their child. And we only intervene and interrupt this in extreme cases. They asserted this happens willy-nilly. Well, no, it only happens in the case of gross abuse. In fact, just to show you how important society thinks the right of parents to choose is, even in cases of clear abuse, we only remove it when it is significant abuse and there's no potential for parents to reform that and prevent it from happening again. Parental rights are important, not just because the parents have a right, but also for the children. We also think it's important when it comes to the right to raise their child in a religious life. We think it's something that's recognised in the right to pursue a religious education in schools, and the right to have a cultural identity. And we think that state schools in many cases can't provide for this, that when you need to be able to pray 5 times a day at school, that when you believe that your cultural and religious values mean you should be protected from exposure to sex and sexuality and many other corrupting influences in society, we say state schools are bad at doing that, not just because they often pursue a moral agenda in order to, that is counter to that religious value, but also because they can't control what the kids tell each other otherwise. And so for some big religions, I'm sure our affirmative supports religious education, but for many religious minorities, like the Sikhs, like smaller sects of Christianity and Judaism, religious schools don't exist. And if they can't homeschool, they can't raise their children to live a good religious life. And that destroys their cultural and religious identity. Secondly, why is it best for kids educationally? We think, what sort of parents do this? Sure, it's often religious people. We think it's also often those who think the state system is failing to deliver good educational outcomes for their children. Even in purely religious cases, we think they want what's best for their children, and educating them well is part of that. And they've shown their commitment to doing that by taking on the burden of homeschooling. I think the vast majority want better outcomes educationally. We think they can provide it. Well, why is that? Because we think homeschooling provides personalised education. And for the case of prodigies, budding authors, people with learning disabilities, in many cases, homeschooling is able to provide that one-on-one attention that is customised to their learning needs that only a farcically imaginary super-funded state system could ever hope to provide. But more than that, we think that that one-on-one attention is critically important. And it's something that every educational survey has shown that that is the most important thing. We actually think fact-supported. In the United States, surveys of 8th and 9th grade year level students in homeschooling act at the level of 12th graders in the state system. Finally, we think it's best for kids socially. Why is this? We think many of us in this room would agree that school was one of the most emotionally traumatising experiences that many of them went through. And for many children with learning disabilities, for many children who come from minority religious backgrounds, school is a place where they are persecuted. And as a result of the bullying that comes from that, they learn to disagree with and to hate further those others. At adult level, they can do better, and the statistics back this. At the end of this debate, we're very proud to report to the audience.
Thank Victor for his comments. I'd like to call now the second speaker for the affirmative, Cameron.
Ladies and gentlemen, Victor wanted to have it two ways in today's debate. He wanted to tell us that the people who educate their children at home are actually the sorts of people who do have very marginalised religious views, which they're more likely to try to protect against state interference. But he also wanted to tell us that these are the people who are going to be achieving better educational outcomes, somehow in spite of those views, in spite of all the incentives that their parents have to actually walk at following the state curriculum in any strict way. What I'm going to talk to you about today is how having the people who are educated at home involved in the schooling process is actually a benefit to the schooling process and of society as a whole. But before I do so, I'm going to engage with 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the role of the government. Secondly, about the effectiveness of homeschooling into the outcomes that are achieved. And thirdly, in terms of religious and cultural identity. In terms of the role of the government, Victor's assertion here was that essentially some people don't want state schooling. Some people don't want even private schooling, and essentially it's their right not to want that. We say that the trend in our society, ladies and gentlemen, has absolutely been in the opposite direction to that. Indeed, one of the most libertarian societies in the United States has recently embraced a system of healthcare that imposes fines on families that don't adopt healthcare. We would put education in the very same category as that, ladies and gentlemen, something that the state actually has an obligation to provide to its citizens. It's an obligation because it ensures, firstly, equal opportunity for children. There's no guarantee, and I'm going to discuss this further in my effectiveness point, that children can get the same educational outcomes out of homeschooling. Secondly, there's a government interest involved here as well, because it is the government's role, ultimately, to provide services for people who do fall through the cracks. And indeed, people don't always have their parents to rely upon, and so some sort of engagement with society is inevitable for children, ladies and gentlemen. So the government has an interest there as well. We said that the government does have a role, ladies and gentlemen, and it's absolutely essential, therefore, that we ban state schooling, homeschooling. We wouldn't ban state schooling. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of effectiveness, the assertion that we had from Victor is that parents often know better about what their children actually need. And it was interesting that he gave us, in terms of his main characterisation, disabled children, because they can get more services and their parents have better knowledge of their needs and what have you. In terms of that category of people, ladies and gentlemen, we say that we actually provide all sorts of services to disabled children in our government schools as they currently exist. And indeed, we have one-on-one monitoring, which is determined on the basis of assessment of individual children and what have you. So that works at the moment. What that characterisation, though, focusing primarily on disabled children, recognise, though, in effect, is that for most children, an objective assessment is actually better. An objective assessment from a teacher who's actually had training in education, actually has an idea of not just what their own children wants and, whether they need to give them rewards because they feel sorry for them or whatever else, or these sorts of factors that come in where you've got that close personal relationship. You actually have an objective assessment. Why is that better in terms of effectiveness, ladies and gentlemen? We say, even if you have a test at the end and a student is able to pass that final assessment, along the way, you lose so many opportunities to actually encourage that child to perform better. You lose the opportunity at grade 8 level for a teacher who's qualified in education to actually say, well, I think your marks could be better, or here is how you can improve. And so we say you have fewer children in homeschooling actually getting the results at the end that they actually want. Moreover, you have kids that actually get results that are fails at the end. And those people do exist in spite of the fact that lots of intelligent parents want to homeschool their children. And that's a harm for society as well. Secondly, we heard socialisation is actually achieved better outside of schools, better at homeschool, because school is emotionally traumatic. Nothing more on that, and it came past 8 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. We say on that issue that minor bullying and what have you is sometimes effective in people's emotional development, and it's important for people to engage with situations such as the workplace, ladies and gentlemen. So on effectiveness, we would say that our model is the better one. It's absolutely necessary to get effective education of our children to do that in a school and not at home. On this third issue of religious and cultural identity, ladies and gentlemen, we firstly say that there is a choice of schools that people can have, and that most groups that we can consider to be within, some idea of normality in their views, actually have somewhere they can go. It's the real fringe groups that we're talking about, who can't go to a Muslim school or to an evangelical Christian school or something like that. We say that it's necessary that they actually get some sort of religious education that goes beyond religion. We say that's important because ultimately you don't want the state creating this idea that it's actually providing education and that its curriculum is allowed to be boycotted by other views creeping in. We also say that the schools can actually accommodate different views, and this is something that I want to talk about in my substantive matter while I move on to it now. 2 points today. First, that parents' involvement in the schooling system improves that schooling system. Second, that children's involvement in the schooling system actually improves diversity. In terms of parents, ladies and gentlemen, we say that homeschool parents are often those parents who are most involved in their children's education. Indeed, that's fairly obvious, that's why they educate them at home. What we say, therefore, is that it's important to have these people involved in our schooling system. In terms of pressuring schools to make the necessary changes, we say that the involvement of parents is absolutely key in terms of P&Cs, in terms of things like writing to the Minister for Education and what have you, complaining about your teaching standards. So we say that when you've got parents at schools, they can lobby for things like swimming classes. They can lobby for things like smaller class sizes, or they can oppose streaming or mixed year groups put in together in the one class. You don't have that same activism where these parents aren't involved. And we know that because schools such as Steiner schools, schools such as private schools, actually have far more accountable mechanisms as a result of the fact that parents are actively involved. They even determine things such as funding decisions in that context, ladies and gentlemen. Something that a public school P&C is often very reluctant to actually engage with. They can do things like make complaints where teachers aren't acting fairly. Do we actually have some sort of mandate to do this to people? We say that yes, we do. It's like jury duty, effectively, ladies and gentlemen. You make a contribution to your society in what is, a basic social function. Here it's education. In the case of jury duty, it's in terms of providing, ensuring our legal system operates fairly. And so, secondly, we say that the interests of these parents and of the schools actually coincide. They want a high quality of education, we want a high quality of education in our schools. So there's no significant harm to the parents in having to be involved in this schooling process. We say they generally would do so. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of diversity, we say that it's absolutely important that schools have a diversity of opinions and views among their students, because that's a way of actually exposing students to more diverse views. We say that Christian or libertarian views are never going to represent a majority in a school, but it's necessary for children to be more tolerant of those views. And indeed, if those children grow up and become leaders of the education department, for instance, they might make schools nicer places so that fewer people feel like they need to be homeschooled. Fewer people feel like they can't fit within that state education system. We say that putting people away in their homes is not an effective way of dealing with questions of social cohesion. So, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the government role, we say the government has one. In terms of our priorities, we say it's in terms of social cohesion and not parental rights in this core state function. And for those reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, Cameron, for his comments. I'd like to call now the second speaker of the media, Ryan.
Let's take this out of debate land and into the real world. It is not a case that parents either care about education or about religion. It's both, ladies and gentlemen. All parents who take their kids out of school and bring them to homeschooling care about their children's education. And we think Cameron's first substantive argument proved that exactly, right? Those are the parents who go and lobby in their schools. Right, because they care about their kids' education, ladies and gentlemen. We reject it. What we'd say is that firstly, we think the reason they take their kids out of homeschooling is because that lobbying has failed. It's because they can't get changes, ladies and gentlemen, in those schools. That's why they pull them out. We don't think it's fair to hold back some kids just to kind of notionally have some slight benefit for everyone else. We think jury duty is completely disanalogous, given that you only do it like once in your life, if that, right? So let's move on to look at two things. Firstly, at the role of the government. Secondly, in terms of choice. Firstly, what we heard was the idea that the government has a role to ensure that there is a maximisation in terms of the children's social capacity and in terms of their education, ladies and gentlemen. On both levels, we think it's just not true. Let's look firstly at education, ladies and gentlemen. What we'd say is that ultimately, like the stats bear out, these children do better. Victor gave you that analysis. I'm going to give you some more. In year 12, these children are usually taking like college-level classes. They are far and away the best performers in universities. And why is that? It's because they get one-on-one attention. Like, the biggest push is to get lower student-teacher ratios in all classes, ladies and gentlemen. That is like one of the single most effective ways to teach a child. That is what you have in this case. You have a teacher directly teaching that child, ladies and gentlemen. They told us that they just can't be objective in this kind of case. That the parents can't be objective. We reject this assertion. We'd say that they have a reason to improve their child's education if they're the ones who are teaching, and they always want to strive to make sure their child does best. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, a teacher in a public school has an incentive to try and raise the weaker students and just make sure that everyone improves. One-on-one means that teacher is always ensuring that that child does as well as they can. But more broadly, they said we should have equality of opportunity. Fine, you should give everyone the option. But let's take the example of healthcare in the United States. Sure, you have to go to a state provider, but you also have a private option, ladies and gentlemen. You can go and do it yourself if you think that will allow you to do it better. That is exactly what we are providing in this instance, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, moving on to look at civic participation of the government. They said we need this in terms of kind of like the children need to learn to be able to participate in our democracy. Firstly, we think you can teach that quite easily. Secondly, we question whether people who have gone through a public school system have great reasoning skills, ladies and gentlemen. We point you to the fact of the popularity of things like tabloid newspapers as probably evidence that most public school kids aren't that smart anyway. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that when you actually have like a one-on-one education, that's when the core stuff gets taught the best. And particularly, we think that when you have a testing mechanism, the parents still have the incentive. Like most of these kids that get homeschooled have an incentive in terms of going through university and college later to get higher education. As a result, we think parents generally try and provide the best education. Let's move on to look at parental choice. What they told us is that ultimately these parents are either intellectually or religiously motivated. We have a couple of responses to that. The first was to say it is ultimately about education, that the statistics bear this kind of out. But what we'd say is that it's a good thing if those children have special needs, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just about disabled kids. And in fact, we say disabled parents are crying out for more services in state schools. They just don't get it. But what we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is that ultimately those kind of special needs kids are the ones who need this, right? If the state can provide it, that's fine. But those aren't the kids that we're concerned about. It's not the kids who can get something from the state. It's the kids who can't get what they need from the state system. That's who we're targeting in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. That's who this debate is actually about. It's about those kind of disabled kids who the state won't care about. It's about those kids where the state just doesn't teach you fast enough. If you're so smart that you're ahead of the rest of your classmate, no amount of like accelerated learning is actually going to help you. And finally, on this idea that actually the parental choice should be overridden because there's problems in terms of interpersonal mixing. We have a couple of responses to this. We'd say that the assertion that bullying is necessarily a good thing is wrong for a start. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's about those cases where it's not effective. Sure, some kids can handle that kind of bullying, but for other kids, the bullying is so bad that it ruins their educational experience. They're the ones we think who get taken out, and that's exactly the point. We'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that moreover, these kids are often more socially well-adjusted. Why is that? It's because these children have been raised in an emotionally safe environment, in an environment where their needs are taken care of, where they have constant attention, where they feel safe and they feel well educated. And it's borne out in the statistics. They actually tend to be more involved when they go to university. By a ratio of something like 50 to 60% extra, they are more active in things like extracurricular activities. They're more active in things like charities, in sports, ladies and gentlemen. These are the kids who do the best. Finally, in terms of diversity, we have a couple of responses to this. We reject the idea, and I'm going to look at this in my positive manner, that when you force kids into the education, they will actually mix and will actually be diversity. But secondly, we'd say, that's an argument for banning religious schools, ladies and gentlemen. That's an argument for banning private schools. We allow those because we accept it's not purely about that level of diversity. So in terms of Cameron's material, and I'm going to deal with this in my own positive manner, is how do these parents actually react when you force this change through? So what happens? We think this is seen as an attack, especially on kind of religious groups. And we think more generally as an attack on these parents. We think they feel cut off and they feel disengaged from the state. That results in two parts. In a best case scenario, we think what they do is undermine state efforts. In the worst case, we think they withdraw entirely. Let's look at the best case scenario. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if you somehow manage to get these kids to school, they will constantly be undermined at home. The state's education system will be undermined at home. Because either we'll have those kind of religious groups and those crazies who will be continually undermining what the state is teaching. They'll be telling their kids that the teacher is stupid, that the curriculum is wrong, you should ignore what is taught. We think that puts the kids in a position where they either ignore what is taught at school, or they're in a position where they are torn between listening to their parents and listening to their teachers. That has harmful educational outcomes. Moreover, they feel persecuted when they go to school. they feel like they're under attack because that's what their parents are telling them. Their parents are telling them that I would love to keep you at home, but the state is forcing me to send you to school. That's when we think, ladies and gentlemen, those kids don't have an incentive to mix with others because they see the school as a fearful, dangerous place. They're going to hang out with people of similar nature. So alternatively, we think the other possibility is that parents don't get involved and engage in the way that Cameron thought that they would. They don't think the state is providing adequate education. They don't go to parent-teacher interviews. They don't think the teacher is going to do anything useful. They don't enforce things like homework because they don't care about what the state is teaching them, ladies and gentlemen. We think these parents are the parents who have tried to actually lobby the state and lobby the schools and don't get that. You need parents on board to support education. And if they're not on board, if they're not working with the teacher, then all those benefits that Cameron wanted to talk about just don't come about. But secondly, let's look at the absolute worst case scenario. We think this can happen for the crazies of the religious groups, and that is that they just withdraw from society entirely. When they're afraid of government intervention and persecution, when they're afraid that any interaction with the state will see their kids taken away from them, put in schools, ladies and gentlemen, their minds polluted by secular filth, that's when they don't interact with the state organs. That's when they're afraid to take the kids to hospitals, to welfare services, ladies and gentlemen, for the fear of them being found out of homeschooling. And who loses out, ladies and gentlemen? It's the children. Ladies and gentlemen, they're the ones who lose out the most because they don't get access to the state services. At the end of this debate, ladies and gentlemen, what we've told you consistently, educationally, the outcomes are better for children. Socially, the outcomes are better for children. But even under their model, we think none of the benefits